He was the face of the Rifleman, a TV hero admired by millions. But behind the fame, Chuck Connor's life wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Hidden struggles and untold stories followed him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Join us as we uncover Chuck Connor's dark secrets that are only now coming to light. Early hardship and restless ambition. Chuck Connors was born on April 10, 1921, in the working-class neighborhood of Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. His parents, Alan and Marcella Connors, had both immigrated from Ireland with the hope of building a better life in America. But instead of opportunity, they found themselves raising a family in the middle of the Great Depression. Money was tight everywhere, and survival often came before dreams. For the Connors family, every dollar mattered, and every meal was the result of sacrifice. Chuck's father worked as a longshoreman, a brutal job on the Brooklyn docks that meant long hours in freezing weather and backbreaking labor for little pay. His mother took on small, irregular jobs wherever she could find them, sewing for neighbors, doing light cleaning, or helping families with odd tasks. There was no guarantee of steady income, and that uncertainty weighed on the household. Their home was modest, meals were simple, and luxuries were non-existent. Growing up in these conditions taught Chuck two lessons early in life. Nothing would ever be handed to him, and if he wanted something more, he would have to fight for it. Poverty had a way of pressing down on children, but Chuck didn't shrink under it. Instead, it gave him resilience. He learned discipline by watching his father endure grueling days without complaint. He learned determination from his mother, who stretched every dollar to make sure the family survived. At the same time, Chuck was not the kind of child to sit quietly with these burdens. He was restless. He needed an outlet, and he found it in sports. Movement gave him a sense of purpose. When he picked up a baseball, a basketball, or a football, the world outside faded for a moment. Sports gave him control in a life where so much felt uncontrollable. In Brooklyn's crowded streets, Chuck developed his athletic abilities with raw energy. He played baseball with neighborhood kids, joined local basketball games, and ran wherever there was space. Track, football, baseball, basketball, he tried them all, and he excelled at every single one. Coaches and teachers quickly noticed his natural ability. He wasn't polished or formally trained, but there was no ignoring his size, speed, and determination. By the time Chuck reached his teenage years, people were already paying attention. At just 14, he caught the eye of talent scouts who recognized that his athletic skills could take him beyond the limits of his neighborhood. He was offered a scholarship to Adelphi Academy, a private school in Brooklyn that catered to wealthier families and offered opportunities that a boy like Chuck could never have imagined. Adelphi was a turning point. For the first time, Chuck was surrounded by students who lived lives very different from his own. They came from families who never worried about their next meal or rent. Instead of being intimidated, Chuck let this fuel him. He wasn't just there to keep up, he wanted to stand out. On the playing fields, he did just that. Baseball, basketball, football, and track, he threw himself into every sport, competing with a fire that his wealthier classmates rarely had. To Chuck, every game mattered, because every game was a chance to prove he belonged. This hunger, born out of hardship, stayed with him. Even as a teenager, there was a quiet intensity behind his calm blue eyes. Coaches and peers alike saw it. He was never satisfied, never willing to coast. The drive to escape the shadows of poverty pushed him harder than anyone else on the field. He knew he couldn't afford to waste a single opportunity. And that future was only just beginning, because soon Chuck's athletic ability would take him places even he never thought possible. The athlete who couldn't find a home. By the early 1940s, Chuck Connors was standing taller than most of his peers, not only in height, but also in ability. After proving himself at Adelphi Academy, he earned a spot at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. At 6 feet 5 inches, With broad shoulders and quick reflexes, he had the kind of build that made coaches eager to see what he could do. Seton Hall quickly became the stage where Chuck showed he was more than just a neighborhood athlete. At the university, Chuck didn't limit himself to one sport. He played basketball, baseball, and even football. Coaches admired his natural talent, but what really set him apart was his stamina and competitiveness. Teammates remembered how he never slowed down in practice and how badly he wanted to win. His presence on the court or the field gave people the sense that he was destined for something bigger. It was here that he earned the nickname Chuck. The name came from his habit of calling out "Chuck it to me" during basketball games. The nickname stuck, and from then on, Kevin Joseph Connors became known simply as Chuck Connors. When World War II interrupted his college years, Chuck served in the Army, but when he returned, he picked up right where he left off in sports. The next big opportunity came in basketball. In 1946, Chuck joined the newly formed Boston Celtics during their very first season in what would later become the NBA. Standing tall, he was one of the biggest men on the court at the time. His size made him an imposing figure, but what history remembers most is one unusual moment. During a game, he became the first NBA player to shatter a backboard. It wasn't intentional, it happened because the equipment in those early days wasn't as strong as what the game uses now. Still, it gave him a strange kind of claim to fame. Even though playing professional basketball was an incredible achievement, Chuck felt something was missing. Basketball didn't feel like the future he had dreamed about. After just one season, he made the bold choice to step away from the Celtics. Instead of chasing a career in basketball, he decided to take a chance on baseball, believing it offered a bigger promise. But baseball, the sport he loved most, brought him his deepest struggles. In 1949, Chuck finally got what he had always wanted, a chance to play in the major leagues. He made his debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers, the hometown team he had idolized as a boy. For a kid from Bay Ridge, putting on that Dodgers uniform should have been the ultimate moment of triumph. Yet his time in the majors lasted only a single game. At bat, he hit into a double play, and before he had the chance to make a second impression, he was sent back to the minors. That one day stuck with him for years. He later admitted that he felt like he had blown everything in that single moment. Still, Chuck wasn't ready to give up. He kept pushing himself in the minor leagues, moving from team to team with the hope that another shot would come. In 1951, he finally got a second chance with the Chicago Cubs. That season, he played in 66 games, hit 2 home runs, and carried a .239 batting average. By most standards, it was a respectable performance, but it wasn't enough to secure a permanent spot. For the next several years, Chuck stayed in the minors, playing wherever he could, first with the Montreal Royals and then the Los Angeles Angels, who were then part of the Pacific Coast League. Each swing of the bat was filled with determination, but the results never matched his effort. While he had the size and presence, he lacked the consistent hitting needed to make it big in the majors. But just when it seemed like his story in sports was closing, something completely unexpected was about to change his life in a way he never imagined. Hollywood by accident. By 1952, Chuck Connors was still chasing the baseball dream. He was playing for the Los Angeles Angels, then a minor league team in the Pacific Coast League. His career in the majors had not worked out the way he wanted, but he was not ready to give up. Every game was a chance to prove himself. That summer, during an ordinary game, he stepped up to the plate and hit a towering home run. It was the kind of hit that grabbed attention, not just for the distance, but for the way he carried himself on the field. In the stands that day was Billy Gordon, a casting director for MGM Studios. Gordon wasn't at the ballpark looking for an actor. He was there to enjoy a game. But when he saw Chuck, tall, rugged, and full of natural presence, he noticed something unusual. Even in the middle of a routine game, Chuck had a certain charisma. Gordon later described him as the Laurence Olivier of the diamond, meaning there was something theatrical about the way Chuck moved and commanded attention. After the game, Gordon approached him in the locker room. He handed Chuck a business card and asked if he had ever thought about acting. Chuck laughed it off. At that time, his entire focus was still on baseball. Hollywood seemed far away, like a different world. But a short time later, an injury sidelined him. It wasn't career-ending, but it gave him a rare moment to pause and consider his future. Out of curiosity, and maybe with nothing to lose, he walked into MGM Studios for a screen test. Within 3 days, Chuck Connors had signed his first Hollywood contract. For a man who had spent years being told he wasn't good enough in sports, this sudden turn was overwhelming. Acting had never been part of his plan, yet here was a door opening wider than any he had seen before. His debut came the same year in the film Pat and Mike, a romantic comedy starring Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Chuck played a small role as a police captain. The part didn't demand much from him, but it gave him a start. Standing on a set with legends like Tracy and Hepburn was intimidating, yet Chuck took it seriously. He watched carefully, studying how seasoned actors delivered their lines and carried themselves in front of the camera. The early years of his acting career were not glamorous. Chuck accepted any role offered to him. Bit parts, background characters, or one-scene appearances. He knew he wasn't trained, so he treated every job like practice. His focus was on building skill and proving he belonged in an industry that was filled with competition. Over the next several years, he worked steadily, even if the roles were small. Then came the project that began to change everything for him. In 1957, Chuck was cast in Walt Disney's Old Yeller, one of the studio's most memorable family films. He played Bern Sanderson, a stern but fair father figure. While the film was centered on the boy and his dog, Chuck's performance stood out. Audiences saw in him a mix of toughness and warmth, a believable balance of authority and care. More importantly, people inside the industry noticed. Casting directors and producers realized that Connors had something rare. He wasn't just tall and rugged, he felt authentic. His presence didn't seem like acting, it seemed lived in, as if he carried the weight of real experiences into every role. And soon enough, that character would arrive, waiting for him in the dusty streets of the Old West, becoming the Rifleman. By 1958, Chuck Connors had spent several years in Hollywood working on small film and television projects. He had proven that he could handle a variety of roles, but he was still searching for the one part that would lift him from supporting actor to household name. That opportunity came when producers were casting for a new television series, The Rifleman. The show's concept was simple but powerful. It followed Lucas McCain, a widowed rancher in the New Mexico Territory, raising his young son while navigating life in the Old West. The role required someone who could project toughness but also compassion, a man who could fight off danger yet still be a tender and guiding father figure. When the producers saw Chuck Connors in Old Yeller, they believed he had exactly what they needed. His size and rugged appearance made him believable as a frontiersman, but his warmth suggested he could also be convincing as a loving father. Chuck accepted the role, and The Rifleman premiered on September 30th, 1958. From the very first episode, the show struck a chord with audiences. Families across America tuned in weekly to watch Lucas McCain raise his son, Mark, while dealing with outlaws, ranchers, and lawmen. The show quickly became a hit, and Chuck Connors was no longer just a former ballplayer trying his hand at acting. He was now the face of one of television's most popular westerns. A big part of what made the show successful was the relationship between Lucas McCain and his son, played by young actor Johnny Crawford. On screen, their bond felt real. Lucas was strong but kind, firm but fair. Viewers saw not just a cowboy, but a father doing his best to guide his child through a difficult world. That sense of authenticity didn't come from acting alone. Off-camera, Chuck and Johnny developed a genuine connection that mirrored their roles on the show. Chuck took Johnny under his wing, becoming a mentor and friend. He invited him on camping trips, fishing outings, and horseback rides. He taught him practical skills, but more importantly, he gave him time and attention. For Johnny, who was only 12 years old when the show began, this bond left a lasting impression. Later in life, he recalled, "He was a real father to me." The affection between them was clear both on and off the screen, and audiences felt it every time they tuned in. While The Rifleman brought Chuck fame and admiration, it also came with an unexpected burden. The role of Lucas McCain was so powerful and so beloved that it began to define him completely. For many fans, he wasn't Chuck Connors the actor. He was Lucas McCain, the heroic single father with a rifle in hand and moral lessons in every episode. This typecasting followed him for the rest of his career. Even when he appeared in other projects, audiences still saw the rancher from The Rifleman. In 1973, Chuck played a significant role in the science fiction film Soylent Green, acting alongside Charlton Heston. But even in such a different setting, some critics and casting directors couldn't help but comment that he still carried the shadow of Lucas McCain. Chuck himself wrestled with this reality. In a 1979 interview, he admitted, "He gave me everything but took away so much." The role had made him famous, but it also trapped him. Other characters never seemed to fit as naturally, and Hollywood producers often doubted whether he could be anything other than the cowboy father. And while the world adored him as America's favorite father, his real-life family was experiencing a very different side of Chuck Connors. Whispers and shadows. Chuck Connors' career reached heights that most actors only dreamed of. He was the star of a hit television series, admired for his commanding presence and striking looks. Yet, behind the polished image, stories circulated about what it was really like to work with him. Those who shared sets with Connors often described two very different men: the charming professional and the unpredictable presence who could shift moods without warning. On set, Connors carried himself with the same authority that made Lucas McCain believable. He had a natural charisma that drew people in, and when he was in good spirits, he could light up a room. He cracked jokes with crew members, encouraged younger actors, and carried himself like a leader. For those moments, working with him felt inspiring, but that warmth didn't always last. Colleagues recalled how quickly he could change, becoming distant or dismissive without explanation. His mood swings left people uncertain about which version of Connors they might encounter on a given day. Some described him as unpredictable, capable of being supportive one moment and cutting the next. For directors and producers, this made him both a valuable star and a difficult personality to manage. While Connors' rugged charm appealed to audiences, it often crossed boundaries in private. Several of his female co-stars later admitted that working with him was uncomfortable. He was known for flirtations that went too far and for advances that were not always welcome. At a time when Hollywood was less willing to confront such behavior openly, many actresses simply chose not to work with him again. One actress, who had shared screen time with him in the 1960s, summed it up clearly. He played a gentleman on screen, but didn't always know where the performance ended. Her words pointed to the gap between the respectful character he portrayed and the behavior she experienced off-camera. While none of these accounts ended his career outright, they contributed to a quiet reputation that followed him through the industry. It wasn't only co-stars who noticed the shift between Connors' charm and volatility. Crew members spoke of how he could be jovial, joking with grips, camera operators, or makeup staff, making everyone feel part of the process. At other times, especially if he felt challenged or slighted, he could turn intimidating. His size and strong personality made those moments difficult for others to ignore. Some crew members admired his intensity, believing it added to his performances. Others felt uneasy, describing the sense that Connors could either inspire or threaten, depending on his mood. A gaffer who worked with him in the late 1960s remembered, "You always knew when Chuck walked in the room. Sometimes you were glad to see him, sometimes you weren't." That duality became a pattern in his career. His presence was impossible to overlook, but it wasn't always easy to handle. Perhaps the most telling descriptions of Connors came from those who saw him over long stretches of time. A director once reflected that working with Connors felt like working with two people. On one side was the man the public adored, strong, dependable, fatherly, and full of charisma. On the other side was a man struggling privately, burdened by loneliness and self-doubt. Crew members spoke of moments when Connors, after finishing a powerful scene, would retreat to his trailer and sit quietly, sometimes in tears. And those shadows only grew more visible as his fame began to fade, a star consumed by his own image. By the 1970s, Chuck Connors was no longer just an actor who had played Lucas McCain. He was in many ways trapped inside him. The Rifleman had given him lasting fame, but it also created a cage. Casting directors and producers saw him as the stoic cowboy father and little else. While some actors reinvented themselves with age, Connors found the industry unwilling to separate him from the role that made him famous. Typecasting became his greatest burden. Scripts came his way, but most were echoes of the Rifleman, variations of a cowboy, sheriff, or rugged father figure. Connors wanted more, yet when he tried to branch out, rejection followed. Roles in comedies, dramas, or thrillers rarely came his way, and when they did, audiences and critics still compared him to Lucas McCain. Instead of escaping the shadow of the Rifleman, Connors leaned into it. Public appearances often highlighted his television past, and he rarely turned down opportunities to discuss the character. Over time, the boundary between Chuck Connors, the man, and Lucas McCain, the figure, blurred. Friends later said he carried himself off-screen as if he were still on the dusty streets of the Old West. It was as if the role had overtaken his true identity, leaving him unable to move forward as an actor or as a person. As his career opportunities shrank, his personal life grew more unstable. Connors became known for volatile relationships, often pursuing women much younger than himself. His marriages had already ended badly, and by this period, he seemed unwilling or unable to build lasting partnerships. Those who spent time around him described him as impulsive, easily frustrated, and prone to sudden outbursts. Part of this volatility came from his obsession with maintaining the aura of stardom. Even as his acting jobs became smaller, he dressed, carried himself, and spoke as though he were still at the center of Hollywood. Public recognition was something he craved, and he struggled when it was absent. Friends noticed that his charm, once effortless, began to feel forced, as though he was performing the role of Chuck Connors, the star, rather than simply being himself. Those who knew Connors best often described him with a mix of admiration and frustration. He had a generous side, capable of warmth and kindness when he chose to show it. He would go out of his way to help friends with opportunities or to impress a room with his humor and presence. At his best, he made people feel valued. But that warmth was inconsistent. The same man who could be magnetic could also turn cold and distant. Friends often felt a wall between themselves and Connors, as though he never fully let anyone in. One longtime acquaintance put it this way: "He could make you feel like the only person in the room until you realized he wasn't really listening." It was a reminder that his charm often masked a deeper emotional distance. By the late years of his career, Connors had built a life almost entirely around the star persona he once earned. Public events, fan conventions, and Western reunions kept him in the spotlight, but they also reminded him of what he had lost. He was celebrated, but more for a character than for himself. The irony was clear. Lucas McCain had given him everything, but also stripped him of the freedom to be anyone else. And as the 1980s approached, the weight of that image would grow heavier, colliding with health struggles that even his strongest performance couldn't hide. The final chapter. By the early 1990s, Chuck Connors was no longer the commanding figure who once filled television screens as Lucas McCain. Decades of hard living, failed marriages, and a relentless struggle to hold on to his image as a star had taken their toll. His health, which had seemed as strong as his public persona, began to collapse. In early 1992, Connors received the diagnosis that would mark his final year: lung cancer. A lifetime of heavy smoking had caught up to him. He had long been known for lighting up both on and off set, and while smoking had once been a common habit in Hollywood, by the 1990s, its dangers were undeniable. Doctors gave him the grim news that the disease had spread, and there was little they could do to stop it. That same year, he was hospitalized again after developing pneumonia. The illness left him weak and bedridden, a sharp contrast to the strong image he had always projected. For friends and fans, it was shocking to see a man who once carried himself with such power now frail and dependent on hospital care. Still, Connors tried to maintain dignity, greeting visitors with his trademark charm even when his body was failing him. On November 10, 1992, Chuck Connors passed away in Los Angeles. He was 71 years old. His death was widely reported, with headlines remembering him as the Rifleman, the role that had defined his career and followed him to the end. His funeral drew friends, colleagues, and family, but one moment stood out. Johnny Crawford, who had played his son Mark on The Rifleman, gave an emotional tribute. Through tears, he said, "He was a real father to me." The words carried weight, because for Crawford, Connors truly had been a mentor and a guiding figure, both on screen and off. Yet for Connors' own sons, the reality was different, marked more by absence and disappointment than fatherly devotion. The contrast at his funeral mirrored the contradiction of his entire life. Connors' death left behind not just a legacy of television fame, but also a lingering puzzle of who he really was. To millions of viewers, he would forever be Lucas McCain, the ideal father, the moral cowboy, the man who stood up for justice while raising his son with love and strength. That image never faded, even decades after the show went off the air. But those who knew him privately described a much different man. To his wives and children, he was often distant, volatile, and consumed by his own stardom. To some of his co-stars, he was charming yet inappropriate, a man whose charisma sometimes carried a darker edge. To friends, he was both generous and cold, present and absent, open and yet unreachable. In the end, Connors lived as a towering contradiction. He was America's father on television, but struggled to be one at home. He was a magnetic charmer who could command attention in any room, but also a partner whose behavior could cause pain. The role of Lucas McCain became his armor, protecting him, elevating him, and ultimately trapping him in an identity he could never fully escape. If you enjoyed this deep dive into his life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more stories about the stars who shaped Hollywood history.